The internet was originally intended to bring us together, to connect us, to make us understand each other better. But something's sort of gone wrong somewhere along the way, and we haven't arrived at that thing, because a bit like the classic story of Pandora's box, once the box was open, all the ills of the digital world came flying out. Things like fake news and misinformation and conspiracy theories and all that stuff that we didn't necessarily bank on. So how can we fix the Splinternet? Because what it's done is it seems to have splintered us into factions, often hostile to each other. So how can we make this a better internet that serves humanity in a better way? Well, I'm joined by three leading experts. Harfoush is a digital anthropologist and New York Times best-selling author. Her most recent book is Hustle and Float, Reclaim Your Creativity and Thrive in a World Obsessed with Work. Rahaf is a member of France's National Digital Council and a visiting policy fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. Marshall van Alstyne is Professor of Management and Information Systems at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University and the co-author, with Jeff Parker, of the international bestseller Platform Revolution. His current work examines the phenomenon of fake news and ways to mitigate the negative effects. And Martin Lindstrom, on the end there, is the CEO and chairman of the Lindstrom company. He's the author of 8 best-selling books, including Brand Sense, Small Data and Biology. His most recent book, Ministry of Common Sense, was ranked #1 on the Wall Street Journal's best-selling list. His current work includes the world's largest Metaverse experiment. So I think we're all very well qualified. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
This subject, we could talk for days, I think, about the Splinternet, but we only have 50 minutes. So what we're gonna do is have a little bit of structure. So I'm gonna invite each of you to make some observations about where we are, how we got here, and tell us a little bit about your current work and how you might be addressing some of the issues. So Rahaf, I'm gonna start with you, if I may.
Okay, well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be on this panel with you. I'm a digital anthropologist, so a lot of my work focuses on the intersection of technology and culture and how they influence each other. I think this is such a fascinating topic, and I have sort of 3 observations that I would love for us to get into in depth. Do we have the slides for the?
Yeah, if you want to.
I think you want to step
I got to go to the podium.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to the podium.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it.
More
You've got your own podium.
I've got my own podium. I feel so great.
You can transition over.
It's always so fun. I'll just start setting up because I don't want to waste a second of this time. Those are not mine. All good. You know what? It's okay. I don't need the slides. Oh, there they are. Perfect. We got them. Thank you. So because I study digital communities, one of the things that I think people misunderstand is they look at what's happening in the fake news space and they tend to look at it just from an individual level or just from what's happening in terms of these like small online communities. When I talk to people, I hear a lot of people saying things like, my uncle is in these WhatsApp groups, or my aunt keeps seeing things on Facebook and they keep sharing them and I don't understand why they're being shared. And so what I do, which is a very interesting part of my job, is I actually lurk in a lot of these communities. I have all these different profiles and I go in and I spend months sometimes just observing, learning, listening, trying to understand what the motivations are. And so I'd like to very quickly just share sort of my view of how I'm looking at the motivations, specifically economic motivations that are underlying some of these principles. So the first thing to know is that the core, the end consumer is always the individual. And this person is a conduit of misinformation. And I say misinformation is because oftentimes they believe the content that they are sharing and that they are consuming. And we're gonna leave them for a second, we'll come back to them later, but the content that they are consuming is actually very much influencing how they view community, how they view connection, and how they view relationships with the people around them. There are other players as well. One of the things that I have been following with fascination is the rise of fake news influencers. So these are people who are anti or climate denier activists. Hello. Climate denier activists or they are really invested in gaining social capital and reputation for participating in these types of industries. And they also have economic models at play. You can buy flat earth sweatshirts, you can buy anti-vax stickers and notebooks, you can pay subscription fees, you can watch videos that are monetized on YouTube, and this is also very much a reputational economy. We also have a factor that I don't think is talked about a lot, which are intentional antagonists, otherwise known as trolls. What's interesting about them from a digital community perspective is that they too are chasing social currency, but the reputation that they're cultivating within their own communities is one where the more chaos they create, the more reputation credibility that they have. And so these three forces are kind of at play when we look at what's happening from an individual and community's perspective. The issue is that if you broaden out, you start to see that all of these dynamics can take place because there are very clear revenue models and businesses. People are making money from this. For example, I trace what's called direct benefits. So these are companies that are selling products and services directly related to the idea that's circulating. So if you are anti-vax, you are selling supplements, right? If you are, you're selling essential oils, you're selling products that are directly benefiting from the disinformation or misinformation that is circulating. There are also indirect economic benefits. These are people that create content farms. So for example, there are businesses who are just invested in getting people to click regardless of what side. We see this a lot in the political sphere, where you'll have the same company creating extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing content with a goal to monetize the clicks and the revenues. And then you also see hidden benefits, and this is where it gets a little tricky. These are companies that benefit from the discourse in ways that are slightly removed. So for example, the latest conspiracy theory of 2023, which is the 15-minute city conspiracy, which we can talk about, that gives a lot of benefit to oil and like big oil companies, and that is being perpetuated by big oil influencers, which I'm sad to say actually exist. And so that is something to look at, that all of these end consumers are being accessed or being manipulated by very specific economic agendas. But there is more, because these economic models themselves are also existing within the algorithmic ecosystem that we all live in. These are the platforms that we use, whether it's Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook. And what you'll see is you'll have platforms whose business models depend on, for example, engagement metrics. So a company like Facebook could say, we don't care so much about the content, we just want the thing that is going to capture your attention the most, and we want the thing that is going to keep you on the platform the longest, which then drives consumer behavior, because then you have the companies that are profiting from it. You have companies that have the AI feeds, so what is being recommended to you? What do you see? What is being suggested? There have been numerous studies done that show that if you are on social networks, some of the content that the algorithm suggests becomes increasingly radicalized over time. You see more and more extreme viewpoints. And finally, you have ad-based revenue. So there is an incentive for companies to be able to target people at a very specific level. So that also then exists within what I also call sort of the policy level, which is where all of these conversations are happening against the backdrop of how governments are approaching the idea of digital economies. So for example, we have national tech policy, so everything from China's AI 2025 plan to Canada's 2030 AI charter. And so you're starting to see countries that are stepping into these spaces trying to figure out how these technologies can influence their standing and their competitiveness. We also have legislation. In Europe, we have the Digital Services Act that is starting to look at some of these platforms and talk about things like accountability and liability around the misinformation that's being spread. And we have the very vague, which can also be its own panel, sort of the geopolitical space, where you have misinformation and disinformation that is being used from foreign governments to influence political discourse. Recently in France, we saw that there was a Russian-backed campaign promoting anti-vax content just to create more of this unease during a time when people were protesting. And from a geopolitics level, we also have governments that are trying to figure out how their citizens can access what parts of the internet. And so all of that becomes a part of this conversation that we're having. And I wanted to say that because often we think like, oh, fake news is this really big problem. We're going to find one solution, but it's not going to be one solution. There might be 20 solutions because each piece of content might arrive in your uncle's WhatsApp group with a very different motivation. Some might be to gain influence, some might be to have chaos, some might be to make money, some might be to sell merchandise. And so until we start peeling aside these intentional motivations, I think we can't really talk about solutions because we're talking about very different stakeholders. Now, the other 2 points that I wanted to make, and I'll come back over here, is that we also need to talk about the psychological benefits that these communities are offering people. So oftentimes I hear things like, oh, you'd be so dumb to believe this. But what you'll find is that when you go into these spaces, these communities beyond the conspiracy theories that are being peddled are places of connection and identity and community. In a place with increasing precarious work, we're losing these third spaces, places that aren't work and aren't home. And so people are going online. People are spending more time being concerned. And so we have to also acknowledge that there is this very big psychological and social benefit. This is also a reflection of the unease in society. When you look at the study of eschatology, which is the study of apocalyptic thinking, which, by the way, if you spend time studying, either makes you a great cocktail guest or a terrible cocktail guest. But what you'll find is that these types of stories always come up. And they always come up in times when there's social injustice and economic inequality. And I could read you examples of apocalyptic stories that are very similar to QAnon that were circulating during the time of the Industrial Revolution. And the very last point I will make is I would love to talk about how digital culture is changing all of this. One of the things that I find to be particularly interesting is we're seeing 2 things. One, the internet is connecting different conspiracy theory communities together. So we're starting to almost have what I'm calling like conspiracy super mutant strains, where you'll have a QAnon conspiracy or the 15-minute city conspiracy that is connecting government overreach community and anti-vaxxers and alternative health and people that believe in the Great Reset. And these communities are communicating with each other and creating an ecosystem which we didn't see before. They used to be quite siloed, like the flat earthers weren't talking to the anti-vax, weren't talking to QAnon, but now they're all talking together, which I think is a fascinating development. And the last point is, with platforms like TikTok, we're also starting to see the shift in how we talk about things. So we're shifting from memes, which were transmitted with images and text, to sound. And on TikTok, what I'm studying and I'm following is the creation of what we're calling like internet-specific dialects, where there's a sound. So if I said to you, Marshall, it's a no bones day, or if I said to you, Martin, our table is broken, and if you're like, what does that mean? Those sounds actually have very specific meaning that are being distributed and circulated by these communities, which means if we don't have conversations about tracking how the values are being transmitted through these sounds, then we're completely missing our ability to be able to decode and interpret this language. And those are the things that I would absolutely love to get into.
Okay, Rahaf, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Marshall, we're talking, Rahaf was alluding to fake news, probably not one simple silver bullet, one magic bullet. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing?
So it's an extremely complex problem. Let me see if I can offer a couple of ideas that we think might possibly help on some of this. So first of all, I'd something like to thank you for having me as part of the conversation. I think the things we're just hearing from Rafa and others are absolutely fascinating. So I think even being able to engage here and after, I think is going to be wonderful. I think you've diagnosed some really interesting problems. So what I'd like to do is to give you 2 things today. One of them is ways to think about the problem. And the other is I want to specifically try to give you a set of new rights that I think might actually help go after this problem. So I want to start with a very simple question. Does increasing access to information increase information overlap? Often there are these ideas that you might educate folks, you might provide additional information. Is this going to help solve the problem? Some interesting work on that. So the intuition might be, just on a basic observation, that with no time constraints, no rationality constraints, as you get this whole world interconnected, Mark Zuckerberg's idea bringing us all together, you might see as you move left to right on the diagram, one individual will be connected to all the other individuals having the same information, so everything might become fully integrated. But what I want to do then is to add to that this idea that Herb Simon suggested, that there are bounded rationality constraints. So what is it that information consumes? Well, he says it's rather obvious. What information consumes is the attention of the recipient. So you have to allocate that attention carefully or efficiently among those that might consume it. So what happens if you have bounded rationality constraints? If you increase the access or the connectivity, you might see as you move from left to right, you actually get more balkanized, more fragmented, more polarized groups by virtue of folks choosing that information that they want among this whole ocean or galaxy of information that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, but they've now chosen the more filter bubble view of the world. And then there's a wonderful quote that came in very recent research. With all of this massive information, what happens is truth decay. When people have so crowded information, such crowded information channels are so overloaded, they fall back on intuition and tribalism as the metrics to help them decide. And if you look at the data on it, recent data suggests that social media have in fact increased polarization. And it's not just on Twitter and Facebook and content like whether the election was stolen or whether there's anti-vax. What's fascinating, if you look at what their beliefs are, there's red and blue science books. So what folks are buying on Amazon relative to science is actually related to now what they're believing previously. It's really quite frustrating. To give you a little bit of background on it, this is something that I wrote on in dissertation with Eric Brynjolfsson back in, dating myself, 1997. So there's an article on that. We're actually predicting that this information or crush of information could actually lead to this kind of cyber balkanization in space as information overload happens. One important message to come out of that was that it's preferences that matter. It's not the information. If folks have tastes for homophily, for affinity, for narrow preferences, then you get this polarization. If they have tastes for diversity, then you do get integration. So one of the solutions that we can do is to try to educate toward tastes of diversity so they seek exposure, they seek alternate ideas, rather than those things that are simply confirming. So in answer to that basic question, does increasing access to information increase information overlap? No, if preferences are narrow, but yes, if preferences are broad. I think that's one of the things that we can actually do to help. Now, let's address fake news. What are the issues with fake news and what are the solutions? I'm going to assert that this is the list of every set of fake news solutions that I'm aware of, whether it's demoting it in the news feed, whether it is providing truth chasers, whether it is tagging and truth labeling, whether it's fact checking with crowds or algorithms. I'm going to argue that every single one of these solutions that I'm aware of suffers from at least one, if not four, fundamental problems. The first is an arms race. Any technology you can use to recognize fake news, you can recognize the filter to avoid the recognition. So arms race is a problem. The second is simply discrediting the rater. If folks are going to lie about the content, well, they're going to lie about being rated. So you simply undermine the credibility of the folks doing the rating. So how are you going to solve that? The third one I think is underappreciated is I would say the responsibility is placed on the wrong foot in the vast majority of these solutions. They ask the responsibility to put it on the platform or worse, on the recipient when it's the author that knows they're lying. So most of the responsibility should put the responsibility on the author, not on the listener on this. And the last one is a solution I don't know any of these mechanisms address at all. None of them, not one. At the moment, it's always cheaper to produce fake news than honest journalism. The cost structure is fundamentally different. So none of the solutions address, in my view, what are the core issues. I also think that the problem is not necessarily correctly conceived. Most of it think that truth is the issue, and I'm going to argue that's not the case, because there's plenty of truth, fake news that doesn't matter, and plenty of true news that does. To give you one or two examples on the fake side, is Pluto a planet? Is an asteroid. It isn't going to affect your life very much. There was a great restaurant downtown, which was Jay's, that said, eat at Jay's and live forever. That's scientifically provably false, and they didn't survive COVID, so clearly it didn't work. But the worst thing that would have happened is that you had a great meal. Or think about two half-truths that are used to create a lie. The politician that did take the vaccine and did die, but it had nothing to do with COVID, right? So those are interesting statements. Or the Russians using news about gun violence to animate gun rights voters, but to suppress black votes. Very interesting. Legally, you cannot own truth. You cannot be dispossessed of truth. If that's the case, legal mechanisms focusing on truth won't work. I like to reinterpret the problem as something different, which is the clear communication of information that causes decision errors or externalities. This is the damage that occurs off-platform. So, for example, the loss of herd immunity from anti-vax. It's the shooting in pizza parlors. It's the insurrections that occur in Washington and in Brazil based on the lie of a stolen election. The interesting thing is one can be liable for decision errors and one can be liable for externalities. This diagnoses the problem a little bit better because what happens is that externalities in an economic sense cause market failures. Market failures require intervention, but guess what? Government intervention in speech is forbidden by the First Amendment. That's our problem. This leads to two really interesting challenges. One of these is that there's too much pollution. We've just heard from Rahaf wonderful stories about what's happening. People are not internalizing the damage that they're causing. The second is there's too little correction. Why? Courts are turning it over to the marketplace of ideas, but markets cannot self-correct market failures, so it doesn't work. So what do we do about it? There are only two known solutions to externality problems. The first of these are centralized by Arthur Pigou. That's problematic because of the First Amendment. The second ones are decentralized solutions designed by Ronald Coase. How do you create property rights in missing markets in externalities? How do we do that? So here's want to give you two new rights as possible solutions to this. Right number one is you don't have on Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or any of them. I simply want to give you an individual right to receive information based on criteria of your own choosing, not the platform's choosing, your own choosing. If you want BBC or Breitbart or any combination, that's your right. I want to highlight in red, yes, this can lead to balkanization as you choose to hear only what you want to hear. We'll come back to that. At the same time, I want to give you another right, which is the right to be heard. An individual has the right to influence the decisions that affect them. Notice, by the way, in red is this other line. Well, there might be a tendency to lie because if you're trying to influence the decisions that affect you, you might actually try to create advantage. But here's the problem. This right to choose your sources is a right not to hear, but the right to hear means these two things are in conflict. How would we balance these rights in a way that would solve this problem? I'm going to argue that we can use ideas from two Nobel Prize-winning areas on information asymmetry economics and on externality economics. So what I want to do, I want to give free speakers two different capabilities. You can express yourself in any way you wish, facts or opinions, but if you express yourself as facts, you gain a new privilege, a new right. Your message will be inserted into the information stream of people that don't want to hear it, conditional on you're willing to warrant that it's true. You can't warrant opinions, so you can't impose them on others. But if you warrant your facts, you can. Notice what this does. This gives a listener a right to be free of false claims and to be protected by liability if those claims are wrong. It gives speakers a right to be heard subject to liability obligation if you're wrong. Let's take an interesting case and show you how this works. One case I think most of us are familiar with is the Hunter Biden laptop story in this case. So what happens in this? There's all this news about whether or not this is his emails, whether or not he turned over the laptop to a computer store, and whether or not this actually happened. It was trying to release before the election, and was this a Russian disinformation campaign or not? So here's the question. Would Rudy Giuliani or Bannon or New York Post be willing to warrant those claims are valid, meaning they're legal and they are true? If no, then that reaches all of their own audience completely unfiltered. So if you're a subscriber to Breitbart, if you're a subscriber to New York Post, it goes through completely. But notice, because it's not warranted, platforms don't have to carry it, and if you're liberal, you don't have to hear it. If they are willing to warrant it, then what happens? All of the original folks get it, but now it is inserted into the other news streams. So liberals will have to hear it. If they want to own the libs, they can, but anyone can challenge the claim. If you didn't want it and you can prove that it's wrong, you can actually then collect the warrant. What does this do? It does a variety of different things. So one of these is unwarranted content reaches any listener that you want. So that was the original one, so there's no problem with that. Refusal to warrant signals you don't really believe that it's true. As a historical fact, one of the co-authors on the original story didn't put his byline on because he didn't believe it. If you're not willing to warrant it, then are you willing to stand by the story? If New York Post won't warrant, then they can't complain they're being censored because they weren't willing to vouchsafe the content. But here's where it also gets really interesting. Suppose they do warrant it, shows up in everyone else's news feed, and Hunter Biden won't challenge it. Then guess what? It was probably true. It actually solves this externality problem, and it balances the truth mechanisms. This has a number of benefits. I won't go into all of them here, but I think there are a couple of really important ones. First and foremost, it addresses every single one of those 4 problems I mentioned earlier. It gets us out of the arms race problem. The adjudication would be handled by peers, and that's much harder to discredit. It's also the case it puts this responsibility on the source, it's on the speaker. You have to choose whether your facts are true or not. It also changes the cost structure. All of a sudden, truth is cheap because warrants cost you nothing. Lies are expensive because you're going to have to honor them. I also want to point out 2 other benefits. One of these, no content whatsoever is censored at all. Each side gets to put their best facts on the table, and everyone gets to see what the verdict is. No content censorship. 2, the most important one, no central authority whatsoever. It is not government, not the platform, not a powerful individual makes a decision. We've designed a Cozy market that is totally decentralized, so no single party has authority to make that decision. The source and the destination is exactly like trading rights in CO2 with independent adjudication on that. So we've removed the center and tried to create some mechanism in that. So with that, I hope it's a means by giving you rights, we might actually help solve this and create decentralized marketplaces to address some of the wonderful problems and internalize the externalities that Rahaf had so kindly and correctly identified. Thank you.
Fantastic, Marshall. Really, really good. And I would encourage you, we've got such a fantastic panel. Please send in your questions, and I will endeavour to put the questions to the learned panel members. Martin, you're up.
Oh, me. Well, think about this, that everything we have been talking about today, more or less, actually has happened over just 19 years. Since 2004, where Facebook arrived in this very city, and where the concept of social media certainly happened. And the consequences have been pretty severe. I mean, first of all, we are now challenging the concept of democracy. 2, we have the idea of fake news becoming a household name, right? But 3rd, probably most concerning, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, is the ramifications of this. A recent study now shows that 1/3 of all young girls in this very country are considering committing suicide. Now, if you feel this is bad, and I think a lot of us do, I would claim this is nothing compared to what we are likely to witness very soon. And I'm going to mention a word which you already are sick and tired of, I know, the metaverse. Isn't that gone already? Well, I'll come back to that in a second. But what is this metaverse thing? Well, first of all, I don't want to define it for you because I think it's still in definition. But one thing I do want to say about it is it's a combination of 2 things. It really is this world of many. Just take Ariana Grande, which didn't have her usual 72,000 in the audience, but 78 million people showing up watching her concert. That is the metaverse of many, one side of this emerged reality. But you also have the metaverse of one. And the metaverse of one is scary, in my opinion. It is the place where suddenly we are seeing we as human beings are being changed fundamentally. A good example of that would really be an example from Korea. I'm going to share with you a very disturbing video, and I hope that you are up for it because it certainly changed my view of the future. This is a South Korean woman. She lost her daughter a couple of years ago when her daughter was, I think, 7 years of age. She's, of course, been depressed and in anxiety ever since, until the moment where a South Korean TV station approached her and said, "We have good news. We found your daughter. This time, she's now in the metaverse."
엄마 어디 있었어? 엄마 내 생각했어?
맨날 해.
나는 엄마 많이 보고 싶었어.
엄마도 너 보고 싶었어. 우리 나연이. 나연아. 나연이 잘 있었어? 엄마 나연이 보고 싶었어.
I mean, there's three things coming to my mind right now. First of all, this mother, she'd probably be stuck in this universe forever trying to find that lost love she once had. But I also have some other questions. One is, who owns her daughter? Is it the designer? Is it the mom? Is it some corporation? Do you need to have a subscription to your daughter before she dies? Is that what we're talking about? I think there's some fundamental questions being asked right now which we are not answering at the moment. And then, of course, you're saying to me, well, okay, the metaverse is just a fad. It's gone. But think about this for a second. If you take a look at the numbers, I think it's pretty stunning what we're seeing. Now, one can, of course, argue if these numbers are true. There's lots of different sources out there. But in general, I think it's fair to say that we, in the United States, at least an average American adult, are spending around 10.5 hours on average per day glued to a screen. Now, if you take a look at Generation C, we're up to 75% of our awakening time. No matter if it's 70% or 75%, this is a lot of time. In fact, our claim, we're already right now having one foot into this metaverse, you could say in a 2D version, which is not with all the bells and whistles. And of course, one day, those fancy, sexy Apple glasses will arrive on your doorstep, right? And I know I don't want to go into the metaverse, of course, but what if you're wearing those glasses and suddenly you can see everyone around you, you remember their names and what you talked about 15 years ago. Think about this. Suddenly you are part of the inner crowd and the rest, which are these dumb people who can't remember anything because they're not wearing these glasses. Well, they're not part of this, whatever we call that virtual world. This is the issue. I don't think it's a question about if, but rather when this metaverse thing is happening. And this is the reason why I'm a bit concerned, I have to say, because here's the issue. We should have asked a fundamental question back in 2004 when social media kicked off. One question which should have probably at least addressed this issue. We never asked that question. The issue is, what is that question? To solve this whole thing, it doesn't exist. One thing we probably could have done is to experiment, to simulate what the consequences would have been of all this. Would we have solved the whole issue around it? Absolutely not. But it may be, just maybe, we would have had a tendency to figure out where issues would have occurred in the future. We didn't do that. I would claim that what we are going to witness now is going to be the last station, the last train station before the train departs. And if we don't one more time get together and address this fundamental issue about what we are doing wrong and how we can correct it before it's happening, I think we have a serious problem, to be honest. So what is this? Well, that's the reason why just a year ago we kicked off what has shown to become the largest metaverse experiment in the world. It's a $22 million experiment where we basically have thousands of people moving into the metaverse, whatever that means, because this is still in definition. What we're trying to do is to simulate the extremes. By extreme, I mean what is the extreme of advertising, contextual advertising, sponsorship, product placement, plot placement, of course, all the other dimensions we just heard the amazing speakers talk about in terms of fake news, community, sense of belonging, all these different aspects. What are the extremes of that? And that's exactly what we want to do. We teamed up now, and I'm really proud to say that, with 22 of the largest brands in the world. And what we're doing now is to take one topic at a time and go into the extreme. We're going to simulate what does it mean, what are the consequences of this. And once we know what that is, we're going to create a little picket fence in a smaller space saying that's probably the safest area we can operate within. Now, I know this is not going to solve the issue, but what it probably is going to do is to at least take the largest brands in the world and have them sign up to a pledge of what they should and what they shouldn't do. Remember, they also have the credibility on the line when it comes to them being cancelled. And if we can create a trend among those brands and ensure that they at least are keeping themselves on check, hopefully it can create some sort of, let's say, halo effect to more businesses out there. So this is really our starting point, working on all sorts of different industries and verticals in partnership with who's who of our associations and organizations around the world. And this, of course, is to be continued. It's a project which, of course, in many ways is going to raise probably more questions than giving answers. But hopefully, just hopefully, this can be a small step towards us stopping and pausing at that last station before we run on that fancy, new, intriguing train. I'm going to jump back to our panel and see where we land.
Good. Three fantastic points of view, three very different points of view. Martin, I'm gonna stick with you. We've got a great question come in. I mean, it was harrowing, to be honest. I found it harrowing. Your clip of the lady with her daughter. Someone's asking, what happens to that woman neurologically and physically when she experiences this? And what research is being done to make sure that her experience is safely therapeutic and beneficial as opposed to detrimental? I think your point is that there aren't any guarantees and that we don't know.
Well, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a two-minute long story. It's actually one of our colleagues in our company which was out for a dinner with his girlfriend, and she went to the bathroom. She was gone for half an hour. Later on, they flicked through her phone by coincidence, and she had 50 selfies shot in that bathroom. And of course, he said to her, "Why did you do that?" And she replied back, "Because I know you're going to break up with me right now, and I wanted to preserve that feeling I had with you before it happened." People always ask, why do we take selfies? I think it's because we want to freeze a moment, and then you activate that feeling later on, just like when you watch the same movie again and again, is to activate that feeling you had the first time. Now, why do I tell you that? There's three reasons why. One, we are increasingly preserving or storing our emotions in a cloud. Two, an experiment done using fMRI in Oxford shows that when people were asked short-term memory questions like, what is the J standing for in JF Kennedy? People are not even thinking anymore. They grab the phone, yeah, I know what the answer is. Well, that's really not the answer because we don't think anymore. We are thinking about another place. And in this fMRI study, they more or less said it was the Google spot. We actually were outsourcing it to a spot, which means the answer is online. So we are storing our short-term memory. I mean, do you remember your wife's phone number? Just questioning here, right? 3.
That's not fair.
Yeah. And this is on the record, right? Just so you know, right? 3, I was here in Boston doing some work with iRobots for Roomba. And we were spending time with a lady, and she just lost her husband. And she said the first thing I did was to subscribe or renew my subscription to iPhotos, because else I'll lose all my memories. These are 3 examples of us outsourcing our feelings, our memories, and our behaviors to some extent in a cloud. And if you cut that off, it's almost like cutting off an arm, right? I think we will have an increasing degree of anxiety, depressing, and languishing as a consequence of this. Because it's almost like we're knocking on a glass window. We can't even see the glass windows there. We just feel empty. And I think that is the first beginning we're seeing of really a huge consequence. So back to your question, yes, we're going to have extraordinary damages happening Of course, it can also be flipped around. And no, we in huge dialogues with many hospitals around the world about the benefits, and you actually can heal people when it comes to using placebo or what we call metacebo effects by basically priming people to get out of post-war syndrome issues or depression or pain, which you can redirect. So it's both the good and the bad and the ugly here, but yes, it has a profound impact.
So could I briefly connect his work to Rahaf's work? Because I actually think there's some really important thing going on here. So the emotions this woman is experiencing with her daughter, I fear are going to be exploited for corporate benefit if what it's doing is creating more of her engagement.
Yeah.
And what I would worry about if it's the metaverse that's deciding how it's done, it's for the controller of the metaverse and not for her. So one of the things I would really worry about is whom can we give agency? Can we give her control so it's for her benefit? Or do the companies retain control so it's for their benefit? And I think we need to manage that because she could experience very different emotions that are positive or negative, they're addictive or restorative. And I think we need to give her the agency to make it the positive and the restorative and not the addictive.
Yeah. Rahaf, do you want to come back on that? Because I mean, this is, I think one of the things I took from your presentation is you know, the Splinternet is not divisive by accident, it's divisive by design, and we've allowed these organizations to build business. I mean, what kind of a business model is this, that it's manipulative of our emotions increasingly, but also sending us, using algorithms which basically send us stuff that makes us angry. I mean, that's a new business model. Maybe it's not a new business model.
I mean, I want to just start by saying, like, I think that maybe we need to also have a conversation about humans and what it means to be human, because sometimes I hear this overly optimistic definition of how these technologies are either going to save the world or ruin the world, and people think it's a binary choice, and I don't think it's either or, I think it's both. And the reason why the technology looks the way that it looks in our society is because it is a reflection of our intent as a society, the intent to help and the intent to harm. And to your example about grief, which is an industry I'm very much interested in, death tech, forget the metaverse for a second. In August of last year, Amazon announced that they had created an experimental feature with Alexa where if you provided 60 seconds worth of audio voice footage, like audio recording, that they could integrate that and make that person's voice, so your grandma that had passed on, as a part of the Alexa's interface. So you could interface with your grandma who can read you books and give you recipe advices through this device. So put that point there. The other point was they had also, a couple of months prior, patented an algorithm where through Alexa's listening capacity, she could determine emotional states. She could determine when you're sad, she can determine when you're angry, with the goal of selling you stuff. So what happens if you have a device that can accurately predict your emotional state, and then that can make suggestions, but those suggestions are coming through the voice of a loved one? And this isn't the metaverse, this is now, this is the past actually, this happened a couple of months ago. So for me, instead of, we can't just mediate by platform, we actually have to look at the intentions and the motivations. And I would argue that the bigger question is that these companies are doing it because it makes money. And right now, our society, regardless of all of our concerns, is prioritizing economic performance, the rise of unicorns, bragging about multi-billion-dollar algorithms, because that is more important than the conversations around digital public health. And what I would say to this conversation as well is when you look at in New Zealand, former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, she was the first politician to introduce the concept of a wellness economy, which goes beyond GDP, but also looks at digital wellness, where one of the things she proposed that governments measure is the health and civility of discourse online as a reflection of the health of the digital public good. And so you have to have those conversations, like less about the metaverse and even Alexa and more about what are we rewarding as behaviors, because if they weren't getting rewards, they wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, so that talks to a conversation we were having over dinner last night about what the capitalist machine and the direction you point it in and what you make the priorities. But please send some questions in. We have this fabulous panel. We've only got them for another sort of 20 minutes or so. So please send us the questions, and I will do my best to put them to the experts. Marshall, question for you. He says, finding the question. Explaining the First Amendment as the root problem. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about this, the freedom of speech and First Amendment stuff. But explaining the First Amendment as a root problem reveals an opinion, though stated as a fact. How is that different from those that believe the First Amendment is the solution and express that as a fact? We can think of certain people that might come to mind. So we report, you decide. So no Supreme Court. And this is the thing. There's always another side to it.
So the beauty of this is actually, it's not that I decide, and it's actually not that a government decides. What's interesting about this is the author's composition that gets them to decide. So you might have half a dozen different ways to express your sentiment. But now the question is, which of these half dozen that you, the author, are going to decide in order to pierce someone else's unwillingness to hear it? So it's the whole beauty is it's absolutely not what I decide. It's not what government, it's really the author that's making that choice. So they're going to have to convince an independent body that that was the right phrasing and what they're claiming is true. So it's precisely designed so that I wouldn't have control or another, but it's designed so the author gets to decide that.
Okay, we have another question, just a follow-up question, not necessarily from the same person, but asking about anonymous sources. Is this, if people have got to sign up and put their name to something, are we going to lose the ability for people to speak off the record?
I love this. This is exactly what should happen. So think of it in the following way. So one of the things it should do is should absolutely protect the whistleblower, at the same time protect us from the troll. So how would this work? The beauty is the warrant attaches to the claim, not to the identity. What we use at the moment for certification is the identity. So you have to know who the party is, so you have to know who the whistleblower is in order to trust them or not. If, however, they can provide the data together with the warrant and both sides challenge, you don't have to know who that was. So you could even make a claim in a totalitarian regime or whatnot, and you wouldn't have to know the whistleblower. Flip that. Suppose I want to use the same mechanism to smear somebody. I'm still going to have to provide the evidence, even though there's the anonymity. But if I can't back it up, then the smear won't stick. So it should actually solve exactly the anonymity question.
Okay. Did you want to come back on that?
My concern and my interest in your thinking on this is that if I'm understanding the solution correctly, the application of a warrant would indicate that there's an assumption that there's a mutual investment in a healthy ecosystem, that people are actually invested in having this discourse. And my concern is that when you look at the business models and when you look at how communities are responding, that's not always the case. And I'll give you an example. On Instagram, there are anti-vax accounts that have been fact-checked, where it says on the post, these claims have been, are shown to not be true. And those claims have been taken as digital badges of honor by these creators. And these creators say, we're doing something right because they're trying to censor us. And so they're taking the fact that they're being not censored, but that the veracity of their claims are being questioned. And they're saying, no, this is all a part of the conspiracy. And I wonder if part of the investment in this rhetoric of we're being attacked, we're being oppressed, we're being silenced, becomes used because there are parties that are absolutely invested in the opposite. They want the anger. And what was interesting to me was the research that came out from Parler, where when you had a network that had just one political group, there was less engagement because people weren't fighting. No one was owning anybody, no one was arguing, no one was being oppressed. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what do you do if the person playing the game isn't playing the same game? They don't want to play the same rules, and actually they want to use your rules to subvert the game.
I love this question because I think we can actually deal with it. So I'll give you two tiers of answers to this particular question. Remember, what I want to do is I want to give everyone two different sets of rights. I want to give them listener rights and I want to give them speakers' rights. Included in the speaker's right is this ability to pierce the filter bubble. I can reach the anti-vax audience if I'm willing to warrant the claim. Now what happens is if they didn't want to smear and say that I'm true, what happens is they challenge it, but then it goes off to an independent body to check whether it's true, and their whole community learns that they can't refute my claim anymore. So now if I've presented actual factual claims that dispute their anger, if you will, then an independent body that they can't they can no longer discredit because it's truly independent. It's a sample of adjudicated peers. And we can use any of the standard levels of doubt, whether it's preponderance of evidence, whether it's beyond reasonable doubt. If it's beyond reasonable doubt, it's very hard to, again, discredit the rater in that case. The second tier of solution here is, I want it to be the case that it's business model compatible. So one of your things I think is really interesting about your own research is that the engagement is what's driving these algorithms, because they want the anger, they want the fury. But if, as a listener, I can choose between Fox and CNN and others, you would have these alternate information streams where you could choose the quality. These each can become their own revenue source for the baseline platform, so we can create a different business model where there's truly genuine competition among information streams on top to provide that different evidence. My point being at two levels. One, each side can contest the other's claims. Nothing is hidden, and both gets to present their best evidence to the audience that needs to see it. And hopefully, this should be business model compatible.
Oh, interesting, fascinating. I'm going to ask you in a minute about what's going on at Meta and Twitter in terms of trying to switch to subscription models, but just hold that because I want to bring Martin back in. So I've got a question here. As Rahaf said, businesses are already monetizing, benefiting from misinformation engagement. How will Martin, on his own, convince his brand leaders to give up profits to do the right thing?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, the good news is we have the cancel culture right now, and that's also impacting brands. And you could say the brands in many ways are keeping organizations in check, right? Mm-hmm. It's the last resort of keeping them in check. So I think increasingly what we're seeing right now when I talk to business leaders around the world, that they have realized it cannot just go on the bottom line, all of it. You have to invest in sustainability and in this particular topic as well, because they can see it's a ticking bomb. So I'm actually not finding it that difficult to convince them to do it.
Do we take your big experiment? I mean, hopefully that's a sign. I mean, because I know one of your reasoning is to try to create some kind of ethical guardrails around this. But the fact that you're managing to get, I mean, you could interpret it either way. You're getting corporate funding. That's a good sign, isn't it? Potentially.
I think it is. Listen, I cannot persuade anyone to do anything unless they put the money on the table, because then they're vested in it. Yeah. But what they're also doing as they team up with me, which is a non-profit activity, is basically to say we are willing to explore and investigate this, but we're also willing to listen to what you're saying and follow that advice. And that's where we are right now with the contracts we have with the companies. So what we're saying to all of our partners now is that they're giving a pledge, a concrete pledge to do something, and they don't have influence on that pledge. But here's the issue. If a company is not teaming up with a group like ours, or whoever it is out there, they are incredibly vulnerable, because you have companies sitting where they have two people sitting in an office exploring the metaverse. They have no idea about what they're messing around with. What I'm basically saying to them is we will be 22 companies where we all have each other's back. So if we as a unified entity are saying, well, that's what we fundamentally believe in, then I think it's possible to make a change happen. And I also want to wind back for a second, because I have a very different approach to this, of course, as one typically would have in an institution like MIT. I mean, back in 2008, I did the largest neuroscience study in the world, where we scanned 2,000 smokers' brains using fMRI to understand the impact on health warnings on cigarette packs. And what we learned was it has the reverse impact. People actually smoke more the more they see the health warnings. But what I learned out of this crazy experiment, which later on was published by 3 independent papers, right? What I learned from this was that you actually can impact governments, because we then said, well, here's the solution to the design of the cigarette packs. And we did a roadshow to 60 countries, and today I'm proud to say that 60 countries in the world have fundamentally changed the health warnings on cigarette packs as a consequence. What we learned out of this is it's possible to make a change, but it should be happening from a commercial point of view first. Then you have the evidence that they are aligned, and then you can give, with a solid feedback and solid insight, these tools to the government, and then it's up to them if they want to buy into it or not. Hopefully they'll buy into it. So that's sort of my approach here.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Can I add one idea? 'Cause I think you've identified some wonderfully interesting challenges. And let me see if we can bring some economic tools to help you out.
Thank
with
you.
Some of these things.
Bring it on.
So,
You're recording this, so I can listen to it later on, right?
one of the things I think Rahaf identified beautifully is that the companies are motivated to do this. In some sense, they're internalizing the benefits of the engagement, of the positive externalities of your social networks. They're internalizing, but they're shedding all the costs of the negative externalities. Those are some of the things that are going on. One of the things that's always been so challenging, in U.S. law, and I think there are variants in international law, is that how do we hold platforms accountable when, according to Section 230, which is the laws that protect them, they're not liable for what users post. They're also not liable for their choices of amplification of what they choose. So there's one, which is the users totally support that. I think that's right. They shouldn't be. But there's this other question about the amplification of what they're doing that does cause this extra damage. The arguments have always been, how do you hold them possible for 500 million messages a day? There's no way they can inspect it. Totally legitimate argument. I buy that. But here's the solution. We're at MIT. We can apply a little bit of math here. Really simple. Once we recognize this as a pollution problem, we take statistical samples. A temporal limit theorem can guarantee any level of certainty you want just by taking a larger sample. You can get it wrong a couple of times, won't matter, but take a bigger sample. Think of it. A doctor doesn't check your cholesterol by taking all of your blood. He or she takes a sample. Well, then we know how much terrorist activity they're amplifying, or how much child porn they're amplifying, or how much stolen content they're amplifying, and we hold them accountable for that. Facebook already reports on the self-harm and the misinformation. All we need to do is to hold them accountable to the flow rate of pollution. Then they'll internalize the externalities, and that, I think, will actually help solve some of these problems while still being consistent with giving free speech. We actually protect the original post. We hold them accountable on the amplification.
I love that idea. Let's make it happen.
Hey, listen, we are good. I knew this was going to happen. We're going to run out of time. That's what's going to happen. I mean, I said we could speak for days on this, but I do want to put one point to each of you. I referenced Pandora's box at the beginning of the session, and of course, the thing that was left at the bottom was hope. I'm going to ask each of you in turn, are we at an inflection point? Is the metaverse an inflection point? You talked about the last train. Are we are we hopeful for the future? Are you hopeful for the future?
Yeah, I mean, you and I have had this conversation before. I'm definitely hopeful. I think I'm a tech dualist. I think it's going to be awesome and it's going to be terrible at the same time. And we just have to make sure the choices are erring more often towards the awesome.
Okay. Marshall?
I am actually hopeful. I'm quite hopeful. What I like to do is I like to draw a metaphor between what we're experiencing now in the internet era and what we experienced 100, 120 years ago in the industrial era. All kinds of horrible things happened with pollution and labor and yellow journalism with misinformation at that time. And it took a while for our institutions to catch up with the technologies at that time, and we're experiencing the same thing all over again. And one of the things I'm hoping we can do with our research here is to build the institutions, to design them to solve exactly those problems, and I think we can. We're behind the curve, but I think we will get there. So I think we'll get some of the benefits, and yes, it will be great and it'll be awful all at the same time.
Okay, fantastic. Martin, last train. Are we at an inflection point? Was the metaverse the solution? Is it just more the same?
I'm not hopeful.
You're not? Oh.
No, I'm not hopeful. No, I'm not.
Well, why did I end on, shouldn't have ended on you then if I didn't end
Well, let's not fake the reality. I mean, I think the issue here is the world has never gone this fast and will never be this slow again. And you're absolutely right. We've had historic references, but they never happen as fast as they do right now. And we've gotten to a point where our brains can't follow this. We can't follow this anymore. So yes, maybe you have small pockets of hope. No, I'm not hopeful.
Okay, all right. And on that note, well, we're going to have to get you back and have another conversation, each of you, I think. So no, fantastic. I really enjoyed the conversation, even if we didn't like the last tone. But Martin, thank you, Martin Lindstrom. Marshall, a pleasure. Rafa, fantastic. Thank you so much. And please stick around and join our next session.
Thanks, everybody. So we'll be moving into a short break and we'll be starting again in 10 minutes, top of the hour at 11 a.m. Eastern. We'll see you then.